The courtroom was silent. Every eye was fixed on the woman standing in the witness box, her hands shaking as she held up the one piece of evidence that no one had expected, a pair of red lace underwear. Gasps filled the room. The judge raised an eyebrow. The husband, seated at the defendant's table, went pale. The woman's voice trembled, but her fury burned through. This does not belong to me. The courtroom murmured in shock. The husband's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The opposing lawyer leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. I found this under my husband's pillow, she continued. And when I confronted him, he told me the most ridiculous lie I have ever heard in my life. He said it was a gift for me. Laughter rippled through the courtroom, but the woman was not amused. She pointed straight at her husband, her face red with anger. You think I wouldn't notice? You think I wouldn't check? It's not even my size, she shouted. This is proof, Your Honor. Proof that my husband has been lying, cheating, and making a fool of me. The husband looked like he wanted to disappear. The judge was about to speak when, bam, the courtroom doors flew open. A woman stormed in, her high heels clicking angrily against the floor. Her long black hair whipped around as she pointed a finger at the husband. You liar. You told me you were single. The room exploded in chaos. The wife's jaw dropped. The husband's lawyer buried his face in his hands. The husband looked like he had seen a ghost. The judge banged the gavel. Order in the court. But the drama was only beginning. Months before this dramatic moment in court, the woman had started noticing strange things about her husband. It wasn't one big sign, but a collection of little things that didn't sit right. At first, it was the late nights. Her husband had always been a homebody, preferring to stay in and watch TV. But suddenly, he had work meetings every other evening. The smell of cheap perfume clung to his clothes when he came back. She had asked him about it. Why do you smell like a woman's perfume? He had laughed nervously. Must have been from the office. One of my coworkers wears really strong perfume. A reasonable excuse. Maybe she was being paranoid. Then came the phone calls. He had always been careless with his phone, leaving it anywhere in the house. But now he kept it on him at all times. The moment she walked into the room, he would flip it over or shove it into his pocket. One night, curiosity got the best of her. While he was in the shower, she tried to unlock his phone. Wrong password. Strange. He had never changed it before. She tried a few more times, but the screen locked her out. Her heart pounded. Something was definitely wrong. Then, the final straw, the underwear. It was laundry day, and she was cleaning their bedroom when she found it. A lacy red pair of underwear stuffed under his pillow. Her stomach dropped. She held it up, staring at it like it was a venomous snake. She had never owned anything like this. It was too small for her. The tag was still on it, as if it had been bought recently. Her hands shook as she placed it back exactly where she had found it. That night, when her husband came home, she waited. She watched him go about his normal routine, pretending everything was fine. Then, as they lay in bed, she asked casually, Honey, where did you get me that red lace underwear? She felt him stiffen. It was quick, but she noticed. Oh, he chuckled nervously. I bought it for you. A surprise, but I forgot to give it to you. He turned to her with a forced smile. Do you like it? Her blood boiled. The audacity. Instead of arguing, she smiled sweetly. Oh, I love it. But you know what? What? She leaned in close, her voice soft but deadly. It's not my size. His face drained of color. She had him. From that moment on, she began planning. She collected every suspicious receipt, every text message she managed to glimpse, every single thing that proved her husband was cheating. She was going to destroy him, but not in private. She was going to do it in court. And now, as the other woman stormed into the courtroom, the husband realized his nightmare had only just begun. The wife crossed her arms, watching her husband squirm. She had set the trap, and he had walked right into it. But she wasn't finished yet. Just as the courtroom settled down, something even more shocking happened. The other woman, still fuming, reached into her bag and pulled something out. The wife's heart stopped. It was another pair of underwear, identical to the one she had found. She held it up for everyone to see and turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have proof that this man is a serial liar and cheater. The entire room held its breath. Then, with a smirk, she looked straight at the wife. "And you're not the only one he's been fooling." The wife's eyes widened. The judge slammed the gavel again. "Order! Order in the court." The husband let out a shaky breath. This is a misunderstanding. But the damage was done, and this was just the beginning. The wife stared at the other woman, her hands curling into fists. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as everyone tried to make sense of what had just happened. The judge massaged his temples, clearly exhausted. "Silence," he commanded, banging the gavel once more. But silence wasn't going to come easily. The other woman, tall, furious, and unafraid, was still holding up the second pair of red lace underwear like it was a smoking gun. The wife took a slow, deep breath. Then she asked the question everyone in the room wanted to know. "What do you mean I'm not the only one?" The other woman turned her sharp gaze to her. "Exactly what I said. Your husband isn't just cheating on you with me." The wife felt the ground beneath her tilt. She had expected a fight in court, but she had assumed the enemy was just one woman. Now it seemed the battlefield was much bigger. The husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. But the man was too stunned to respond. "Would you care to explain?" the judge asked, rubbing his forehead. The other woman smirked. "Gladly." The wife braced herself. "This man," the woman began, pointing directly at the husband, "told me he was single. He took me to fancy restaurants, bought me gifts, sent me sweet messages every morning." She scoffed. "I believed every single lie, until," she paused for effect, "I found out about her." She pointed at the wife. The courtroom gasped again. The wife's heart pounded. "How did you find out?" The woman pulled out her phone and scrolled before holding it up. The wife stepped forward, and her blood ran cold. On the screen was a picture. Her picture. A selfie she had taken months ago at her husband's office party. "Your husband had the nerve to leave a picture of his actual wife on his social media," the woman said with a bitter laugh. "One of my friends recognized you and told me." The wife swallowed. The husband was a fool. A reckless fool. She turned to look at him. He had his head down, avoiding her eyes. But the other woman wasn't finished. She pulled out another phone, different from the first. "Now, this is where things get really interesting," she said. "Because guess what? I wasn't the only girlfriend." The entire courtroom gasped in unison. The wife gripped the edge of the witness stand. The other woman tapped the screen and held it up. A video played. A third woman appeared. Younger. Prettier. Speaking in a soft, nervous voice. "My name is Sandra," she said in the video. "And I just found out that the man I've been dating for 6 months is married." The wife's knees nearly buckled. The husband's lawyer groaned. The judge sighed heavily. The crowd erupted into chaos. "Order in the court," the judge bellowed. The wife closed her eyes, trying to contain the storm raging inside her. Her husband wasn't just cheating. He was a full-blown con artist. She opened her eyes and glared at him. "How many?" she asked coldly. The husband didn't answer. The other woman, still enjoying herself, smirked. "Why don't we call Sandra and ask her?" She held up the phone and dialed. The courtroom fell silent. 1 ring, 2 rings. Then, "Hello." A soft, hesitant voice echoed through the room. The wife clenched her jaw. "Sandra," she said into the microphone, "how long have you been seeing my husband?" A pause. Then, "Your husband?" The voice on the other end sounded confused. "Do you mean David?" The wife froze. David wasn't her husband's name. A strange tension filled the air. "Wait a minute," the other woman said, narrowing her eyes. "Are we talking about the same man?" The wife grabbed the phone from her, quickly sending a picture of her husband. "Is this the man you've been dating?" There was silence on the other end. Then, "No," Sanders said. "That's not David. That's my father." The wife's blood turned to ice. The entire courtroom went deathly silent. The husband shot to his feet. "What?" he croaked. Sanders' voice was trembling now. "Why do you have a picture of my dad?" The wife looked at her husband, her stomach twisting into knots. "Because," she whispered, "he's my husband." Then the line went dead. The other woman took a step back, covering her mouth in shock. The judge leaned forward, staring at the husband in disbelief. The husband shook his head. No, that's not." But it was too late. The damage was done. The wife's entire body felt cold. This wasn't just a cheating scandal anymore. This was something much, much worse. And she wasn't sure she was ready to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. But she would. Oh, she would. The courtroom was frozen in silence. The weight of Sandra's words hung in the air like a thick fog. That's not my boyfriend, that's my father. The wife's hands clenched the edges of the witness stand. Her mind raced. Her stomach twisted. This had gone from a cheating scandal to something much darker, something that made her skin crawl. The husband, no, this man, stood at the defendant's table, his face pale, sweat forming on his forehead. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," he addressed the husband, his voice steady but firm. "Would you care to explain what exactly is happening here?" The husband, Carter, finally snapped out of his frozen state. "This is a misunderstanding," he shouted, his voice shaking. "I don't know what she's talking about. This is crazy." The wife felt her fury burn hotter. A misunderstanding? A misunderstanding? She turned to face him, her voice as sharp as a knife. "So you're telling me that this girl's father, this so-called David, just happens to look exactly like you? Is that what you expect me to believe?" Carter's lips trembled. His lawyer was practically burying his head in his hands. The other woman, still standing tall, took a step forward. "I don't know about you," she said, folding her arms, "but I'd love to get to the bottom of this." The courtroom door suddenly burst open. Everyone turned, eyes wide as another woman rushed inside, heels clacking against the floor. Her sharp suit and expensive jewelry made her look like she belonged in a business meeting, not a courtroom. But it wasn't her appearance that sent chills down the wife's spine. It was her face. She was the same woman from Carter's phone background, the one she had seen once, the one she had ignored because he had told her it was just an old family picture. The woman's heels came to a halt. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on Carter. Then she spoke, her voice dangerously calm. Well, she said, "isn't this interesting?" Carter looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The wife swallowed hard. Who was this woman? Before anyone could say a word, the woman pulled something out of her handbag, a marriage certificate. The room erupted into gasps once again. The wife felt the floor tilt beneath her. She shook her head, not wanting to believe what she was seeing. Her voice was a whisper. "You're married?" The woman's lips curled into a smirk. "That's right," she said, holding up the certificate for all to see. And not just to anyone. She turned her cold gaze to Carter. "I am Mrs. Olivia Carter." The wife's heart stopped. Carter was already married. Before her. Before all of them. This wasn't just infidelity. This was bigamy. Her legs felt weak, but she refused to fall. She refused to let this man, this liar, see her break. But Olivia wasn't done. She took a step closer, locking eyes with the wife. "And from what I'm hearing," she said, tilting her head, "it seems like I wasn't the only one being lied to." The wife couldn't breathe. She had walked into this courtroom thinking she was exposing a cheating husband. She had no idea she was about to find out she was never even his real wife to begin with. And she had a feeling this was just the beginning. Because Carter had been hiding more than just affairs. He had been hiding his entire life. And now it was all about to come crashing down. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The wife, no, was she even a wife? Felt her knees tremble beneath her. Carter wasn't just a liar. He wasn't just a cheater. He was a fraud. Her mind replayed Olivia's words. "I am Mrs. Olivia Carter." The wife turned to her husband, or whatever he was, her heart pounding. "Tell me this is a joke," she whispered. "Tell me she's lying." Carter didn't answer. He was frozen, his face white as a sheet. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, I believe we all need an explanation." The wife stared at him, waiting, daring him to speak. Finally, Carter's lips moved. His voice was weak, barely above a whisper. This is a mistake." The wife's nails dug into her palms. "A mistake," she echoed, her voice shaking. "A mistake." Her hands slammed against the table. "You lied to me. You made me believe I was your wife. You." Her voice cracked. She had spent years building a life with him, years trusting him. And now, in the span of a few minutes, she had lost everything. The courtroom door burst open again. All heads snapped toward it. A young woman stood there, her face pale, her hands gripping the doorframe. And then, "Dad," she whispered. The world stopped. The wife turned slowly, her body rigid. The girl in the doorway couldn't have been older than 20. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. And Carter? Carter collapsed into his chair. The wife's heart pounded. "Who is this?" she demanded. No answer. The girl took a shaky step forward. "Dad," she repeated, this time louder. The wife turned to Olivia, the real Mrs. Carter. "Who is she?" Olivia crossed her arms, her expression blank. "Oh," she said flatly, "that's our daughter." The wife's entire world tilted. She stumbled backward, gripping the table for support. You have a daughter?" Olivia smirked. "Yes, and unlike you, I actually knew she existed." Her ears were ringing. Carter had a daughter, a grown daughter, which meant he had been lying about his past long before he had ever met her. The young woman, still standing in the doorway, turned her wide, teary eyes to the wife. Yours wife?" The wife opened her mouth, then shut it. She didn't know how to answer, because at this point, she didn't know what she was. The room was silent, all eyes bouncing between them. And then, Carter snapped. "Enough," he bellowed, his voice cracking through the silence. He shot up from his chair, slamming his fists onto the table. "I have had enough of this circus." His breathing was heavy, his face red with fury. He pointed at the wife. "You had no right bringing our personal life into this courtroom." The wife recoiled. "No right," she hissed. "You lied to me for years. You made me think I was your wife." Carter clenched his jaw. "You are my wife," he snapped. Olivia scoffed. "That's funny," she said, "because last time I checked, I was your wife." The wife shook her head in disbelief. "So what is it?" she demanded. "Which one of us is your real wife?" Carter's breathing grew heavier. And then, he laughed. A low, bitter, unhinged laugh. "Neither of you," he muttered. The wife's blood ran cold. The entire courtroom held its breath. Olivia narrowed her eyes. "What did you just say?" Carter lifted his head, his eyes dark, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "I said," he whispered, "neither of you are my wife." The wife felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. The room erupted into chaos. The judge banged the gavel, but it was useless. The wife turned to Carter, her voice a breathless whisper. What do you mean?" Carter exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. "None of this matters anymore." The wife took a step forward. "No," she said. "You don't get to brush this off." "What do you mean?" Carter hesitated, his jaw clenched. And then, a voice echoed from the back of the courtroom. "Oh, I can tell you exactly what he means." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the back. A man stood there, dressed in a sharp black suit. His face was calm, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, knowing. The wife had never seen him before. But Carter's face turned ghostly white. And then, for the first time since this nightmare started, Carter looked truly afraid. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Every pair of eyes turned toward the man in the black suit. His expression was calm, almost too calm, but there was something about his presence that sent chills down the wife's spine. She turned to Carter, her cheating, lying fraud of a husband. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he looked scared. The wife felt a strange, twisted satisfaction at that. The man in the black suit took slow, measured steps forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. His sharp gaze never left Carter. "Hello, David." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The wife's breath hitched. "David," she whispered. She turned to Carter, confusion clouding her mind. Who was he talking to? Carter, no, David, was frozen in place. His lips parted, but no words came out. The wife's heart pounded. "Who is David?" The man in the suit smirked. "That," he said smoothly, "is a very interesting question." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a file. Thick, heavy, filled with papers. He lifted it in the air. "Would you like to know who your husband really is?" The wife's blood ran cold. The judge, who had been struggling to keep the courtroom in order, rubbed his temples before gesturing to the man. "State your name and your connection to this case." The man smiled, tucking the folder under his arm. "My name is Detective Harris," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "And I've been investigating David Carter, or should I say, the man sitting at that table, for quite some time." Gasps filled the room. The wife felt her knees weaken. "An investigation?" Detective Harris opened the file and pulled out a sheet of paper. He lifted it up for the judge. "Your Honor, I have in my possession undeniable evidence that this man, who claims to be Carter, is living under a false identity." The courtroom erupted. The wife felt the world spin around her. "False identity?" she whispered. What does that mean?" The detective turned to her, his expression serious. "It means," he said, "that the man you married doesn't exist." Her stomach dropped. She shook her head violently. "No, that's impossible." Olivia, Carter's other wife, folded her arms. "You're telling me this man isn't even who he says he is?" she scoffed. "Oh, this just keeps getting better." Carter, or whatever his real name was sweating now, his hands clenched into fists. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I don't know what this man is talking about." Detective Harris sighed. "Really?" He pulled out another sheet of paper and handed it to the judge. "Then explain this." The judge adjusted his glasses and scanned the document. His eyes widened. He looked up sharply. "This is a marriage certificate," the judge announced, with a completely different name listed as the groom. The wife's breath caught in her throat. "What name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The judge hesitated. Then he looked at her. "Daniel Reynolds." The wife's hands went ice cold. Daniel Reynolds? She had never heard that name before in her life. She turned to Carter. "Daniel," her entire body shaking. Who are you?" Daniel's eyes darted around the room, like a trapped animal. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind racing for a way out. The detective smirked. "Ah, there it is." The wife blinked. "There what is?" The detective chuckled. "That look," he said, tilting his head at Daniel. "That's the look of a man who knows his game is over." Daniel shot to his feet. "You don't know anything," he shouted. The room tensed. The detective pulled out another document. "You're right," he said. "Maybe I don't know everything." He tossed the paper onto the judge's desk. "But the FBI sure does." The room exploded into chaos. The wife couldn't breathe. The FBI? Her husband? No, this stranger was being investigated by the FBI? Olivia's jaw dropped. "You're kidding," she whispered. "The FBI?" Daniel, Carter, David, whoever he was breathing heavily now. His face was red, his body tense. The judge slammed his gavel. "I demand order in this courtroom." But there was no order. The wife grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. Her entire world was crumbling. The detective leaned in, his voice quieter now. "You see, David, or Daniel, or whatever name you're going by these days," he smirked. "You didn't just lie to these women." His eyes darkened. "You lied to the government." Daniel's face drained of color. The wife felt like she was in a nightmare. None of this made sense. "How did this go?" The detective turned to the wife. "I think it's time you knew the truth," he said. "Your husband isn't just a liar." He paused. Then he turned back to Daniel, his eyes narrowing. "He's a wanted criminal." The courtroom gasped. The wife stopped breathing. Daniel, her husband, the man she had shared a life with, wasn't just unfaithful. He was dangerous. She looked at him, her chest rising and falling, panic clawing at her throat. "Who are you?" she whispered. Daniel's eyes darted to the doors. The detective caught the movement instantly. And then, Daniel made a run for it. The courtroom erupted into screams. The judge banged his gavel furiously. "Stop him!" But Daniel was already shoving past people, knocking over chairs, sending papers flying. The wife's heart was racing. This man, this stranger, wasn't going to stay and explain. He was running, and that meant only one thing. He had something even bigger to hide. Chaos erupted as Daniel, or whatever his real name was, sprinted toward the courtroom doors. "Stop him!" the judge roared, slamming his gavel. But Daniel moved like a man who had spent his entire life running. He shoved past people, his arms knocking over chairs and papers. A guard lunged for him, but he ducked, slipping through the crowd. The wife's breath hitched. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her husband, her supposed husband, was a fugitive. Detective Harris was already moving. "Lock those doors," he barked, his voice sharp with authority. But Daniel was fast, too fast. His body twisted, and with a single motion, he flipped over the witness stand. Gasps filled the room. The wife staggered back. Was he always this athletic? This strong? She had never seen him move like that. Then, bang! A gunshot rang out. Screams followed. People ducked. Some ran. The judge nearly fell from his chair. Daniel froze. A security guard stood near the entrance, gun raised, eyes locked on him. "Don't move." Daniel's hands twitched. His breathing was heavy. He looked to the left, then the right. His mind raced. Then, in a single moment, he did the unthinkable. He grabbed the closest person, Sandra, his own daughter. The wife gasped in horror. "Let me go," Sandra screamed, struggling in his grip. But Daniel's arm wrapped around her neck like a steel vise. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. "Dad, stop," she sobbed. But Daniel's face was blank, empty. His eyes were cold. "This is your fault," he muttered, his grip tightening. "All of you." Detective Harris's voice was sharp. "Let the girl go, Daniel. You're making this worse." Daniel pressed his forehead against Sandra's temple. "I always make it worse," he muttered. "Don't I?" The wife's stomach churned. Who was this man? Olivia, standing frozen near the judge's bench, spoke for the first time since Daniel had grabbed their daughter. "You're a monster." Daniel's jaw clenched. "No," he whispered. "I'm a survivor." His grip on Sandra tightened. She whimpered, her face pale. The wife's hands curled into fists. "Let her go," she screamed. Daniel's eyes flicked to her. Something in them shifted. A flicker of pain? Regret? Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "I can't." And with those words, Daniel ran, dragging Sandra with him. The courtroom exploded into movement. Detective Harris lunged forward. Security guards sprinted after them. The wife's legs moved on instinct, her heart hammering in her chest. Daniel shoved open the doors, his grip still locked around Sandra. The chase had begun. The courthouse halls were a blur. Daniel sprinted, weaving through the crowd. Sandra kicked and screamed, but he held her tight. His breath was ragged. His mind raced. He needed an exit. He needed out. Behind him, he could hear the pounding footsteps of Detective Harris and the guards. The shouts of people screaming. The wife calling his name. But he didn't stop. He couldn't, because if he got caught, it was over. Then he saw it. An emergency exit. Adrenaline pumped through his veins. He ran harder, faster, dragging Sandra along. Sandra clawed at his arm. "Dad, please." Something in his face twitched. Then, bang, another gunshot. The bullet hit the wall, inches from his head. Daniel stumbled, his body jerking to the side. Sandra took her chance. She bit his arm. Hard. Daniel howled in pain. His grip loosened. Sandra ripped free. She ran, straight into Detective Harris's arms. Daniel's eyes widened. "No," he breathed. Everything collapsed. Detective Harris pushed Sandra behind him, gun trained on Daniel. "It's over." Daniel's chest rose and fell rapidly. He turned, glanced at the emergency exit. Freedom was inches away. But then, the wife stepped forward. Daniel stilled. Her eyes burned with fury, with pain, with betrayal. She took another step, and another, until she was just a foot away from him. "You ruined everything," she whispered. Daniel's lips parted, and, for the first time, he looked ashamed. But he never got to finish, because the next moment, Detective Harris tackled him to the ground. Daniel screamed as his body hit the cold marble floor. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. It was over. Finally, over. The wife stared down at him, her chest heaving. Daniel turned his head to look at her. Something flickered in his eyes. Something like regret. She clenched her jaw. It was too late for regrets. Too late for everything. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, the man she had thought was her husband, was nothing but a lie. And now, he was just a prisoner. The detective stood up, wiping his hands. He looked down at Daniel with a satisfied smirk. "Well," he said, "that was dramatic." The wife didn't respond. She just kept staring, because for the first time in years, she realized she had never really known the man she had married. And now, she never would, because Daniel Reynolds, Carter, David, whoever he was gone. The courthouse halls were eerily silent now. The chaos had died down, but the tension still hung in the air like a storm waiting to explode. Daniel, or whatever his real name was, lay on the cold marble floor, his face pressed against it as Detective Harris tightened the handcuffs around his wrists. He didn't fight anymore, didn't resist, didn't say a word. The wife, no, the woman he had deceived for years, stood motionless, staring down at him. Her heart pounded. Her breathing was uneven. So many emotions swirled inside her. Rage, betrayal, disgust, but most of all, a hollow emptiness. She had married a ghost, a man who never even existed. Take him away. The judge's voice cut through the silence, firm and final. The officers pulled Daniel to his feet. His body swayed slightly, but he said nothing. His head was low, his face unreadable. Detective Harris stood in front of him, arms crossed. "Any last words?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. Daniel finally lifted his head. His eyes, dark and empty, locked onto the wife's. A flicker of something unreadable passed through them. Then, finally he spoke. "I did love you," he whispered. The wife's stomach twisted. Her body went rigid. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. She didn't want to believe him, didn't want to let his words matter. But the way he said it, the way his voice cracked just slightly, for a brief, horrible moment, she almost believed him. Almost. Then Detective Harris let out a laugh, breaking the moment. "Oh, come on," he scoffed. "Are we really doing this?" Daniel's eyes flickered to him. His face turned blank again, cold. Then, without another word, the officers dragged him away. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the hall. And just like that, he was gone. The wife didn't remember how she got back home. Everything was a blur. The courtroom, the reporters swarming outside, Olivia's furious voice ringing in her ears, Sandra's sobs. She barely remembered walking out of the courthouse, pushing through the cameras and flashing lights. She barely remembered Detective Harris placing a gentle hand on her shoulder and saying, "It's over now." Because it wasn't over. Not for her. Not for the woman who had spent years sleeping next to a stranger. She stood in the doorway of her home. Their home, but now it felt like a crime scene. Everything inside belonged to a life that wasn't real. The pictures on the walls. The furniture. The scent of his cologne still clinging to the air. She felt like she was suffocating. Like she had been buried alive. Slowly, she walked to the bedroom. Her legs felt heavy. Weak. She reached the bed, their bed, and sat down. Her eyes landed on the pillows. The same pillows under which she had found the red lace underwear. Her chest clenched. She should have known. She should have seen the signs. The lies. The missing pieces. The way he never talked about his past. How had she been so blind? She reached for the pillow with shaking hands. Then, slowly, she lifted it. Her breath hitched, because underneath it was a key. A small, silver key, tucked neatly between the folds of the bedsheets. Her pulse spiked. What was this? She picked it up, her fingers trembling. Her mind raced. A key. To what? The next morning, she stood in front of a storage facility. The key was clutched in her hand. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. She had spent all night wondering where the key belonged. And then, as she was digging through old receipts, she found it. A payment record. A storage unit rented under his name. Her stomach had twisted. What was inside? Secrets? Answers? Or worse, more lies? Now, standing in front of Unit 209, she could barely breathe. Her hands trembled as she slid the key into the lock. She turned it. The door creaked open. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light. And then, her heart stopped, because inside the storage unit were dozens of fake passports, fake IDs, a briefcase full of money, and the worst part, a wedding dress. A wedding dress that wasn't hers. She staggered backward. A horrifying realization sank in. Daniel, Carter, David, whoever he was, had done this before, and he would have done it again. Her entire body went cold. This wasn't just a man who lied. This wasn't just a man who cheated. This was a predator. A man who collected wives like trophies. A man who stole lives, names, identities. Her pulse raced. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The wife, No. The survivor staggered backward, her breathing ragged as she stared into the dark storage unit. The reality of what she had uncovered made her skin crawl. Passports, fake IDs, wads of cash, and that wedding dress. Not hers, someone else's, or maybe more than just one person's. Her hand shook as she reached for one of the passports. She flipped it open, her heart hammering against her ribs. The photo staring back at her was him. But the name? Completely different. She snatched another one. Another name. Another identity. Another lie. A shiver ran down her spine. How many people had he fooled? How many women had fallen into his trap? The storage unit suddenly felt too small. Too dark. Her fingers dug into the edges of the passports, gripping them so tightly they nearly bent. Then, her gaze shifted to the briefcase. Slowly, cautiously, she knelt down and flipped it open. Stacks of cash sat neatly inside, bound in crisp rubber bands. This wasn't pocket money. This was escape money. Her stomach twisted. He was going to run, not just from her, from everything. The moment he had felt the walls closing in, he had been ready to vanish. And she had almost let him. A sharp knock at the storage unit door made her flinch. She spun around, her heart in her throat. Detective Harris stood there, his sharp eyes scanning the scene before settling on her. For once, the usual smirk on his face was gone. "You found it," he said. Her voice came out hoarse. "You knew." He sighed, stepping inside. "Not exactly. We suspected he had assets hidden somewhere, but we didn't have a location. Looks like you did the digging for us." She exhaled shakily, gesturing around. This is more than assets." Her voice trembled. "This is a pattern, a system." Harris nodded grimly, stepping toward the briefcase. "Looks that way." She swallowed hard. "How many?" Harris didn't ask what she meant. He knew. He rubbed his jaw, exhaling. "We're still piecing that together." Her hands curled into fists. "So he's done this before." Harris looked her in the eyes. "Yes." Her entire body stiffened. She had known, deep down, she had known. But hearing it spoken aloud, it made her feel sick. Harris flipped through the stack of passports, his brows furrowing. "These names, I've seen some of them before." Her stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Harris sighed. "We've been tracking cases of identity fraud and marriage scams for years. Women who suddenly discover their husbands aren't who they say they are. Bank accounts drained. Entire lives stolen." Her skin turned to ice. She gestured to the briefcase. "This money, he stole it." "More than likely," Harris muttered. "From multiple women." She felt like she was going to be sick. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the wedding dress, lifting it carefully. The fabric was pristine, untouched, as if he had been saving it for someone new. A fresh victim. The bile rose in her throat. She had been just another name on his list. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "I want to find them." Harris frowned. "Find who?" She lifted her chin, her eyes blazing. "The others," she said. "The other women. The ones he tricked. The ones he stole from. I want to find them." Harris studied her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he exhaled, shaking his head with a smirk. "You're not like most people." "No," she said. "I'm not." Because most people moved on. But she wasn't going to let him win. She was going to end this. For everyone. And Daniel, Carter, David, whoever he was going to pay. The wife. No. The hunter now stood in the dimly lit storage unit, gripping the edges of the wedding dress as the weight of her decision settled over her like a heavy fog. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Detective Harris studied her, one brow raised. "You really want to track them down?" She turned to him, her jaw tight. "I need to know the truth." Harris exhaled. Truth is a dangerous thing, especially when it involves a guy like him. He gestured at the briefcase. Men like this don't just scam and move on. They cover their tracks. And when they run out of places to hide, his eyes darkened. They burn everything behind them. Her stomach twisted. How many women had their lives turned to ash because of him? She turned back to the pile of passports. Each name, each face was another lie. Another broken heart. Another life stolen. "I don't care," she said, voice steady. "I need to find them." Harris ran a hand over his face. "All right," he sighed. Let's start from the beginning. An hour later, they sat in a small office at the precinct. The table was covered in stolen identities. 5 passports, 3 driver's licenses, bank accounts under different names. And worse, Harris placed a missing persons report in front of her. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The photo was of a woman, late 20s, blonde, soft kind eyes, missing for 3 years. Her pulse quickened. Who is she? Harris exhaled. Her name was Sarah Monroe. Was. Not his. A lump formed in her throat. She was engaged to a man named Daniel Carter, Harris continued, tapping the passport on the table. Sound familiar? Her stomach dropped. Her husband, her fake husband, had been engaged to someone else? What happened to her? She whispered. Harris leaned back, vanished without a trace. Her bank account drained. Her apartment cleaned out. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. He shook his head. It was like she just disappeared. The wife's fingers dug into the table. This wasn't just about cheating anymore. This was something worse. Her eyes snapped to Harris. You think he killed her? Harris didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Her breathing grew shallow. No, it couldn't be. He was a liar, a con man, a thief. But a killer? She clutched her stomach. How close had she been to suffering the same fate? Her mind flashed back to moments she had ignored. The way Daniel, Carter, David had changed toward the end. The way he had watched her too closely. The way he had locked certain doors in their house. Her blood ran cold. He was never planning to run. He was planning to erase her. Harris tapped another file. And here's the kicker. She blinked, dragging herself back to the present. What? Harris smirked darkly. We found another storage unit. Her heartbeat stopped. Another one? He slid a paper across the table. Belongs to a David Reynolds. Her hands clenched into fists. Another name. Another life. Another graveyard of lies. She stood abruptly. Where is it? Harris sighed. I knew you'd say that. He pushed his chair back and grabbed his coat. Come on, he said. Let's go dig up another ghost. The second storage unit was in a worse part of town. The air was thick with dust. The hallways smelled of damp cardboard and secrets. Harris held up the key and glanced at her. You sure about this? She met his gaze. I've never been more sure. He gave a small nod, then turned the key. The door creaked open, and inside was something far worse than the first unit. The wife's breath caught in her throat. Photos, hundreds of them, taped to the walls, stacked in boxes. Women, smiling, happy, oblivious. Her pulse skyrocketed. Her own face was among them, pinned to the wall, right next to Olivia's. And Sandra's, and at least a dozen other women. Harris's face hardened. Son of a... She stumbled forward, her hands trembling as she touched one of the photos. A wedding, but not hers, not Olivia's, not anyone she recognized. A different woman. Her hand shook. She ripped it from the wall, flipped it over, and her stomach dropped, because scrawled on the back, in handwriting she knew all too well, was a date. A wedding date, scheduled for 3 months from now. Her vision blurred. He was planning another one. Even while she was preparing to expose him, he had been preparing to replace her. A new wife, a new name, a new victim. She felt her knees buckle. Harris caught her elbow, steadying her. Breathe. She swallowed hard, gripping the photo. He was never going to stop, she whispered. Harris nodded grimly. No, he wasn't. She looked back at the wall, rage replacing fear. For years, she had been his prey, his fool, but not anymore. Now, she was the hunter, and she was going to find her, the woman he was planning to marry, and she was going to save her, even if it was the last thing she did. The weight of the discovery crushed the air from the wife's lungs. The second storage unit wasn't just a graveyard of past victims. It was a roadmap to his next one. Her hands gripped the wedding photo, her fingers trembling as she traced the woman's face. She looked so happy, so clueless, just like she had been. Detective Harris's voice was sharp. We need to find her. Now. She turned to him, her pulse hammering. How? Harris exhaled, scanning the walls. There's got to be something. A receipt. An address. He froze. His eyes locked onto a small notebook tucked into the corner of the storage unit. The wife followed his gaze. A cold feeling slithered down her spine. She reached for it. Harris grabbed it first. "Let me." His voice was tight, careful. Her throat was dry as she nodded. Harris flipped the notebook open. His eyes scanned the pages. His lips pressed into a thin line. Then, his expression darkened. "What?" she demanded. He exhaled slowly, flipping the notebook around for her to see. She stared. The pages were filled with dates, names, locations. Each entry was written in the same familiar handwriting. His handwriting. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just a notebook. It was a record, a detailed log of every woman he had ever targeted. The first date started 15 years ago. The wife's hands curled into fists. "How many?" she whispered. Harris flipped through the pages. His expression turned grim. "Too many." Her vision blurred. Her name was in there. Olivia's. Sarah Monroe's. And at the very bottom, a fresh name. Emma Lawson, the woman in the wedding photo. The wife's heart stopped. Harris flipped to the last page, his brows furrowing. "There's an address here." Her pulse spiked. "Where?" Harris hesitated. Then he read it aloud. The wife's breath hitched. It was only 2 towns away. He was close. Her nails dug into her palms. "She's in danger." Harris nodded. "Yeah, and she has no idea." The wife's entire body was on fire. She had let him get away with too much for too long. Not anymore. She turned to Harris, her jaw tight. "We're going," she said. Harris blinked. "What?" "We're going to find her." Harris sighed. "Look, I admire your determination, but this is a police matter now. We have procedures." "I don't have time for procedures," she snapped. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You said it yourself. He covers his tracks. If we wait, if we do this your way, she could disappear." Harris hesitated. Then he exhaled. "Damn it." He pulled out his keys. "Let's go." The drive was tense. The wife stared out the window, her mind racing. What was she going to say? "Hi, I'm the woman your fiancé was going to erase before replacing with you?" No, that wouldn't work. She clenched her fists. Would Emma even believe her? Would she laugh in her face? Would she already be gone? She swallowed the thought. No, she had to be alive. Because if she wasn't, she would never forgive herself. Harris pulled up to a small suburban house. A charming white picket fence. Roses in the front yard. It was too perfect. The wife's chest tightened. She had once lived in a house just like this. A lie wrapped in a dream. Harris killed the engine. "We don't know what we're walking into," he said. The wife nodded, gripping the door handle. "I don't care." She stepped out. Harris followed, adjusting his badge as they approached the door. The wife's heart was racing. She lifted her fist and knocked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the door cracked open, and Emma Lawson stood there. The wife's breath caught. She was younger, bright-eyed, beautiful, just like Olivia, just like Sarah, just like her. Emma smiled politely. "Can I help you?" The wife opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a familiar voice rang from inside the house. "Babe, who is it?" The wife's entire world stopped. That voice. Him. Daniel. Carter. David. The man who had ruined her life. He was here. Her blood boiled. She shoved past Emma, stormed into the house. Emma yelped, "Hey, but the wife wasn't listening. Because there, standing in the living room, was him. Daniel. Alive. Free. Smiling. Like he hadn't just destroyed her. Like he hadn't just been arrested. Like he wasn't supposed to be rotting in a cell. Her hands shook. Her breath came out in ragged bursts. Daniel's eyes widened. He took a slow step back. "You." She lunged. Harris grabbed her arm just in time, yanking her back. "You monster," she screamed. Emma gasped. "What is going on?" Harris stepped between them, flashing his badge. "Emma Lawson." Emma's face paled. "Why, yes." Harris took a deep breath. "We need to talk." Emma blinked, confusion clouding her features. Then, her eyes flicked to Daniel. And for the first time, the doubt crept in. Daniel's jaw clenched. And in that moment, the wife saw it. That flicker of panic. That exact same look he had given her in the courtroom. He was caught. Again. But this time, she wasn't going to let him run. Not ever again. The tension in the living room was thick. Daniel, or whatever name he was using now, stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his mind racing. The wife could see it. That flicker of panic in his eyes. He was calculating, plotting, looking for an exit. She stepped forward, blocking him. "Not this time," she hissed. Emma still looked bewildered, her brows furrowed as she glanced between them. "Can someone please tell me what's going on?" Daniel forced a chuckle, a mask slipping into place. "Babe, I don't know what they're talking about." He looked at the wife. "You've got the wrong person. I think you should." She snapped. "Shut up." Emma jumped. Daniel's face darkened. Harris was already pulling out a file, flipping it open. "Emma," he said carefully, "do you know this man's full legal name?" Emma blinked, taken aback. "Oh, of course. It's David Lawson." The wife let out a bitter laugh. "David? Again?" Harris held up a passport. "This is the identity he used for my client." He flipped to another. "And this is the one he used before her." Another. "And before her." Emma's lips parted, her breath catching. The wife watched as realization crept in. The doubt. The fear. "No," Emma whispered. That's not true." Daniel moved fast. He grabbed Emma's wrist. "Babe, listen to me." Harris reacted faster. His gun was out in a heartbeat. "Hands off her. Now." Daniel's grip tightened. His jaw flexed. For a second, the wife thought he might run, might fight. But then, slowly, his fingers unclenched. Emma yanked away. She staggered back, trembling. Her eyes darted to the wife. "Is this true?" The wife inhaled sharply. She didn't want to say it, didn't want to shatter this woman's world like hers had been. But she had to. She stepped closer, voice steady. "He lied to you. He lied to me." She hesitated, then added, "He's done this before, Emma, and he was going to do it to you." Emma's face crumbled. Her hands trembled as she stared at Daniel. "Tell me it's not true," she whispered. Daniel's mask cracked just a little. Then, his shoulders straightened, and he did what he always did. He lied. "She's crazy," he said, voice smooth. "She's obsessed with me. I left her, and now she's trying to ruin my life." "Enough." Harris grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. Daniel grunted. "You can't do this." "Shut up." Emma flinched. Her breathing was ragged. Tears filled her eyes. The wife's stomach twisted. She knew exactly what Emma was feeling. The betrayal, the shock, the denial. Because she had been in her exact place. She reached out carefully. "Emma." Emma's body trembled. "I let him into my house," she whispered. "I trusted him." Her eyes filled with rage. And suddenly, she moved. Slap. Her palm connected with Daniel's face. His head snapped to the side. Silence. Then, Emma spat at his feet. "I hope you rot." Daniel slowly turned back, his jaw clenching. But he didn't speak, because he had lost. Harris pulled out his radio. "I need backup. Now." Within minutes, sirens wailed outside. 2 officers stormed in, guns raised. Daniel lifted his hands slowly. Harris smirked. "We're doing this properly this time." The wife's heart pounded. This was it. The real end. One of the officers grabbed Daniel's wrist. Cuffed him. Daniel turned, eyes locking onto the wife's. His lip curled. And then, he smirked. Like he knew something she didn't. Her stomach tightened. What was he thinking? What was he planning? Harris must have noticed. "Get him out of here," he ordered. The officers dragged Daniel away. The wife's body finally relaxed. But not fully. Not until she was sure. Emma collapsed onto the couch. She was still in shock. Her hands clenched. "He almost proposed," she whispered. "He told me he wanted kids." The wife swallowed hard. She had once heard those same words. She sat beside Emma, offering her a tissue. Emma exhaled shakily. "What do I do now?" The wife hesitated. Then she said, the only thing she knew for sure. "You start over." Emma gave a bitter laugh. "And how do you do that?" The wife looked down at her hands. Then, she whispered, "I'll let you know when I figure it out." That night, the wife stood outside the police station. Harris joined her, hands in his pockets. "You good?" he asked. She exhaled. "Not yet." He nodded. "Fair." A beat of silence passed. Then, Harris pulled out a small file. Her brows furrowed. "What's that?" He flipped it open. Her blood ran cold. A photo of Daniel, but younger. And the name beneath it? Neither Carter, nor Reynolds, nor David. A completely different name. Her heartbeat spiked. Harris's voice was grim. "This guy has more layers than we thought." The wife's stomach twisted. Daniel wasn't just a fraud. He wasn't just a con man. He was a ghost. And even behind bars, something told her this wasn't over. The wife, no, the survivor, stood in front of the police station, the cold air biting at her skin. Daniel was gone, locked away, shackled in iron bars where he belonged. And yet, why didn't it feel like the nightmare was over? Detective Harris tapped the file in his hand. You sure you want to see this? She swallowed hard, staring at the document. The name underneath Daniel's newest identity taunted her. This man, this ghost of a man, had been playing this game for years. How long has he been doing this? She whispered. Harris exhaled, flipping through the pages. We're still piecing it together, but at least 15 years. Probably more. Her chest tightened. 15 years. How many lives had he destroyed in that time? How many women had been left shattered in his wake? How did he keep getting away with it? She murmured. Harris shrugged. He was careful, always changing identities, never staying in one place too long. He pointed to the folder. This guy wasn't just a con man. He was a professional. The wife stared at Daniel's photo, his real photo, not the smiling, charming face he had shown her. This was him, a predator, a liar, a nothing. And yet, she had loved him, trusted him, believed in him. Her stomach twisted. Harris closed the file. He's done, he said, his voice firm. With the evidence we have, he won't see the outside of the cell for a very, very long time. A part of her wanted to believe that. But then she remembered the way Daniel had looked at her as he was dragged away. The smirk, the arrogance, the certainty. She shivered. Harris must have noticed. Hey, he said gently. It's over. She blinked. Over. She had spent years building a life that never really existed. And now she had to build a new one. From nothing. A shaky exhale left her lips. I don't know what to do next. Harris chuckled. You and me both. She gave a small, bitter smile. For the first time in months, she felt something close to relief. Not happiness, not peace, but something. A weight lifting. She turned to Harris. Thank you. He raised a brow. For what? For believing me, she said. For helping me. For everything. Harris smirked. Don't get all sentimental on me now. She rolled her eyes, but her heart felt lighter. The nightmare was over. Daniel was behind bars. The truth was out. And Emma? Emma had packed her things and left town that morning. She was starting over. Maybe the wife would too. Maybe she would finally stop calling herself a wife. Maybe she would stop thinking of herself as someone's victim. Because for the first time in a long, long time, she was free. She didn't know where she was going. Didn't know what came next. But she did know one thing. She was never going to be fooled again. Never going to fall for the lies. Never going to be trapped in another man's web. She turned away from the station, the city stretching before her. A new life waiting to be built. A new name waiting to be reclaimed. She wasn't a victim. Not anymore. She was something else entirely. And whatever came next, she was ready.